This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 319 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week was a weird one. It seemed like I had some really good hits, but also some really awful misses at every single position. I usually do pretty well at quarterback, but Kyle Allen busted, and Sam Darnold was better than expected. I did get Jared Goff and Baker Mayfield right, but it was still weird. Brian Hill didn't pan out, but Austin Eckler did, and I got Todd Gurley wrong. The Rams' offensive line actually looked a lot better against the Bears. And then at wide receiver, I liked Deebo Samuel and Randall Cobb. That looked good, but I said that DJ Chark was a little bit overvalued. I think the process for Chark wasn't wrong given some of the ambiguity in that Jags offense, but clearly he wasn't overvalued. So overall, a pretty average week, all things considered. I'm talking about flex plays on this show for the most part, so there are going to be misses. It was just kind of a strange week overall. It was either really, really good or really, really bad. Now, before looking at players this week who I'm higher and lower on versus the consensus, feel free to hit pause on this podcast, go to FanDuel.com, and enter the Thursday night special. Build a lineup with Texans and Colts, the teams who are playing on Thursday night, and enter that lineup for just $9. You've got a shot then at a $150,000 first place prize, and there are $750,000 in total prizes for that contest. So head to FanDuel.com and enter right now. Eligibility restrictions apply. The biggest questions people probably have this week at quarterback are with Dak Prescott and Aaron Rodgers. So I guess I'll do things a little bit differently on today's show and just kick things off with them because I'm slightly lower than the consensus on both of those players. Fantasy Pros right now list Dak as the QB7 and Aaron Rodgers as the QB6. I think they're more low-end QB1 types. Let's start with Dak. Dallas is in New England as 6.5-point underdogs, where the game has a 46.5-point over-under. Now, according to OddsFire, 72% of the money is on the over, so at least that's a good thing. But Dallas's implied team total at the time of this recording is still under 20 points. That's not what you look for. New England's faced an easy schedule for a lot of the season, but even when you adjust for that, quarterbacks have scored 7.2 points below their season-long points per game average when they've faced the Patriots. So we should expect Dak to have a rough day. I think he's a fringe QB1 this week as a result. And a similar argument can be made for Aaron Rodgers. The difference is that Dak has been the better fantasy quarterback this year, even when you adjust for strength of opponent. If you look at those quarterback adjusted numbers, Rodgers is basically the QB8 this year. He's not bad by any means, but it does tell us that he's not a must start in these tough matchups. And that's what he's got this week. Quarterbacks against San Francisco, who Rodgers is facing, they've scored 6.8 fewer points than their season-long average this year when they've gone up against the 49ers. The vast majority of the bets right now are on the over, but the Packers still don't have an overly impressive implied team total. It makes sense to view Aaron Rodgers more as a low-end QB1. I think that's where a lot of quarterbacks kind of sit this week. That includes Baker Mayfield. But I actually think that Baker can be started ahead of Dak and Rodgers. He's facing Miami, giving the Browns one of the highest implied team totals on this week's slate. And the Dolphins have been trash against the pass. They rank 5th worst in yards per attempt allowed, and that's actually 3rd worst when you adjust that for strength of opponent. And Miami has the worst sack rate and the 3rd worst pressure rate in the entire league. So Baker should be able to sit back in the pocket during this entire game. That's big news. Now, Mayfield's obviously not been very good, but when you look at how his opponents have allowed fantasy points, it paints a better picture. His opponents this year have allowed just under 14 standard fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Baker has averaged just 0.4 points below that. So he's been below average, but barely below average. And that's with him being a pretty big positive regression candidate. Based on his yardage total and using yards to touchdowns conversion data over the last 5 years, he should have 3.9 more touchdowns than he currently has. Basically, this on paper is the Baker Mayfield game. I'd be confident playing him. Carson Wentz was someone who seemed pretty undervalued on Fantasy Pros this week as well. The game against Seattle should at least be a little higher scoring than average this week, or at least that's how it projects. And Seattle hasn't been all that great defensively. In terms of fantasy points allowed, they're giving up an additional 2.4 points per game to opposing quarterbacks versus those quarterbacks' season-long averages. And they really haven't been able to get to quarterbacks, ranking 31st in pressure rate this year. Wentz has some questionable pass catchers, but he's also not facing the New England defense this week. He should be ranked higher than QB 16. And then there's Sam Darnold, who I talked about on this week's 15 Transaction Show. Darnold now has back-to-back really strong performances, and he gets an Oakland team this week that's one of the friendliest against fantasy quarterbacks. And it's also one that hasn't been able to generate a lot of pressure on quarterbacks. They're 5th worst in pressure rate. And I'm always a fan when a quarterback can stay upright. So I think Darnold's probably the best traditional streamer this week, though I'd be playing someone like Baker Mayfield over him if he's on your waiver wire. Some of you are going to listen to the show on Friday after the Colts-Texans game has concluded, but I'm intrigued by Nyheim Hines in his matchup in that game. Houston's a favorite in that game against the Colts, which means if they get out to a lead, the Colts are likely to use their pass-catching running back more, which is Nyheim Hines. As I talked about on my 15 Transaction Show, when we saw Hines without Marlon Mack last year, he saw 43% of the team's running back rushes. Now, I doubt that we get to that high of a number in this matchup, but even his 23% mark this past week when Mack was sidelined was basically 2.5 times his season-long average. And Houston's actually allowed the most running back receptions in the NFL this year. That just plays into Hines being an intriguing PPR flex option if you're a little desperate. Game script will need to go his way, but I could see Hines coming through with a decent performance. Now, speaking of game script, it's likely that Bo Scarborough is going to be a pretty game script dependent running back now that he seemed to grab hold of the early down role for Detroit. He didn't see a single target last week, and we shouldn't expect him to be that involved in the passing game with Ty Johnson and J.D. McKissic there. We should probably expect him to continue to see the early down work, though. And Detroit could also be in a positive game script this week because Washington is a very bad football team. The Lions are road favorites, and Washington's allowed 3.4 fantasy points per game above expectation to opposing team running backs. It's one of the higher marks in the league. So I kind of like Scarborough as a flex play. And then a little bit deeper of a play this week is Latavius Murray. Murray's been pretty ineffective over New Orleans' last 2 games because Alvin Kamara's been back. He's carried the ball 15 total times while seeing 5 targets. Those aren't horrible numbers for a backup, but they're not great. The thing is, though, in Week 10, New Orleans ran 71 plays while trailing. So it made sense for Alvin Kamara to be on the field. He's the superior pass-catching back. Murray didn't even play 25% of the team's snaps. In Week 11, in a much friendlier game script, Murray was on the field for 41 of New Orleans snaps, and he saw 10 of the 15 carries that I just talked about. This week, there should be a positive game script for New Orleans. They're 8.5-point home favorites against Carolina. Unlike Tampa Bay last week, though, Carolina hasn't been good at stopping the run this year. Tampa Bay's been the best team in adjusted points allowed to running backs, whereas Carolina is one of the worst. So maybe Latavius Murray finds more success on the ground, and he gives you a flex-worthy start. Now, on the flip side of things, there aren't many running backs who are seeing volume who you should be sitting this week. That's how it is every week. That's why I'm talking about deeper plays and flex plays. But Royce Freeman was someone who I saw ranked as a pretty solid RB3, and I'd be nervous about playing him, even though the matchup is there. Without Joe Flacco, the Broncos haven't been targeting their running backs that much out of the backfield. And honestly, that was really the allure with Royce Freeman for a while. When Joe Flacco was under center, Freeman had a target share of 13%. Over his last 2 games, it's been 4%. Like I said, Buffalo's not a bad matchup, but the floor is no longer there for Royce Freeman. That makes him a risky play. Brian Hill's risky as well against Tampa Bay. His peripheral numbers were actually fine last week. He saw 68% of the team's rushes, he had almost a 10% target share, and he played 60% of the team's snaps. But Tampa Bay's rush defense can't be understated. It's very good. They've allowed the 31st fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs this year, and like I said earlier, their adjusted numbers are out of control. Team running backs are averaging 9.1 fewer points per game against Tampa Bay than they are throughout the rest of the season. Since Brian Hill wasn't locked in as the team's goal line back last week, and since his target share wasn't that impressive, I'm definitely worried about him in this matchup. At wide receiver this week, I'm into DK Metcalf. He's averaged a 25% target share over his last 4 games, and Philadelphia has been bad against opposing wide receivers this year, specifically opposing outside receivers. They've given up the 4th most points to wideouts this season, but against all pass catchers in the slot, they've been arguably the best in the league statistically according to data compiled from Pro Football Focus. Just 21% of targets are going to slot receivers against Philly, and they've allowed just 2 slot touchdowns to go along with a league-low 448 yards. It's because you can attack the perimeter, and that's what I expect Seattle to do in this matchup. Some of you might be questioning whether or not to play Allen Robinson this week, because, well, the Bears quarterback situation is very not pleasant. Robinson saw a lot of Jalen Ramsey last week, though, and he ended up with his lowest target share of the season by far at just 13%. Things should turn around for him this week against the Giants. They've played below expectation in terms of fantasy points allowed, and they're allowing 1.7 more yards per attempt than they should when you adjust for who they've faced. It's a bad secondary, and Robinson should bounce back. Nelson Agholor is getting a lot of heat on social media, and I think the narrative around him has sort of driven his rankings down this week. Realistically, he's not in a bad spot as long as Alshon Jeffrey doesn't play. He still saw 24% of the Eagles' targets last week, and like I said with Carson Wentz, this matchup isn't bad at all. Seattle's been a below average team against wideouts this year. So if Alshon's out, Agholor is in play. And even though T.Y. Hilton is expected to come back this week, Zach Pascal isn't a bad deeper play either. He'll be the number 2 wideout for the Colts, and Houston's been really bad against the pass this season. They've got the lowest pressure rate in football, which is kind of crazy, and they're surrendering 5.1 points above expectation to team wide receivers this year per game. Meaning, we should expect about a 5-point boost from the Colts' normal wide receiver output. That'll benefit Pascal. Golden Tate's in kind of a rough spot against Chicago. The Bears have been a near top 5 team at preventing fantasy points when adjusted for strength of opponent to wide receivers, and they've been above average against the slot as well. 28% of the targets against Chicago have gone to that area of the field. That's a below average mark in the league. So I'm not looking at Golden Tate as anything more than a flex play this week, even in PPR formats. And then there's Curtis Samuel. He's become a completely touchdown-dependent asset in fantasy football, ranking higher than wide receiver 30 4 times, which were his 4 games with a touchdown. And New Orleans has been really good against wide receivers this year, even with a banged-up Marshawn Lattimore. Team wide receivers average 5.6 fewer points per game when they face the Saints. And New Orleans has been beat more in the slot than on the perimeter this year. That's not where Curtis Samuel lines up very often. He's played just 29% of his snaps from the slot this season. That's been Jarius Wright's spot. I've got a couple waiver wire tight ends that you can start this week, starting with Ryan Griffin. I talked about him on the 15 Transactions podcast earlier in the week, but he's seen 14% or more of the Jets' targets in 3 of his last 4 games. And Oakland's a plus matchup for tight ends. So he's in play coming off a big week. As is Jacob Hollister. My buddy Rich Rebar, at Lord Reeves on Twitter, he tweeted out yesterday that Seattle's tight ends have produced 6 tight end 1 games already this season. Russell Wilson's been targeting them above the league average too. Seattle tight ends have a 21% target share on the year. So a player getting volume in a Russell Wilson-led offense is definitely in play. The only problem is that there's been some injury luck in Hollister's favor with Luke Wilson and Ed Dickson being out. But Hollister played himself into a bigger role, I think. And that's what you've got to hope for. He is riskier than advertised, though. Detroit was the streaming defense that I talked about on the 15 Transaction show this week, and they're most definitely in play against Dwayne Haskins. But I'm going to give you 2 other defenses that you could target this week off the wire. One of them is Tennessee. The Titans aren't bad as a standalone defense, but they get what we should probably consider a plus matchup against Jacksonville. Nick Foles was sacked twice and he threw a pick last week in his comeback game, and the Titans are at home, they're favorites, and there's a low over-under in this game. So I think they're a safe bet. Atlanta's not a safe bet, but they do have an interesting ceiling, as we've seen the last couple of weeks. On the 10 Trends show yesterday, I talked about how much more pressure the Falcons are getting now that they switched up play calling duties. And while that might not continue, it's at least something that you can buy into. They're playing in a game with a high over-under, but points allowed matters a lot less in fantasy football than sacks and turnovers. And so far this year, when adjusted for strength of opponent, the Bucs have allowed 2.5 more fantasy points per game to opposing defenses versus those defenses' season-long averages. Quite simply, it's a plus matchup against a turnover-friendly quarterback. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. We've got one more show this week, the Mailbag Show, and that'll drop tomorrow.